We're looking today at the natural wrist hinge to play amazing golf. So many golfers get this wrong. So when we're talking wrist hinge ideally is this kind of flapping action. Most golfers, when I say wrist hinge, think we're talking about this action, which is wrist cocking or radial deviation. So ideally what I'm going to be talking about today is both, because I don't want to stand here and say wrist hinging and you guys think I'm talking about something that I'm not. What I love to see in the golf swing is a wrist cocking action that happens early and then is pretty quiet from there to the top of the swing. Then we can talk about the wrist action on the way down once we've done the backswing. In terms of wrist hinge, I would like to see very little wrist hinge initially in the golf swing, because the more we wrist hinge, which if you again think about is this flapping action, the more the golf club would come behind the hands. Now, as we probably all know and appreciate, we want this golf club to be in line with the hands as we get into this takeaway position. Now, in order to do that, this wrist has got to have very minimal wrist hinge. When we measure this on something like hack motion, what I see with the best players is there is no change in that wrist extension. So wrist extension is the amount of cupping we have in the hand here. And when we're talking the backswing, I would want to see that wrist extension angle not really change. A few degrees I'm absolutely fine with. What we see with most golfers is it changes almost like a trigger as soon as the club goes away. So what that looks like is the butt of this golf club will go to target very early. The right arm gets very wide and the club tends to work in like this with very little wrist loading, okay? So the thumb is very much pointing parallel to the ground. That's what we see on a daily basis. When the wrist hinges like this, generally it also creates this forearm rotation. So we're looking essentially for the opposite to that. What I'm looking for is this wrist not to change its angle and the thumb start to work up. So what we're going to encourage in this video is how we can load and set the wrist, set the arm earlier in the backswing to get this golf club on the rotary arc or plane, and then from there how we can maintain this kind of L shape to the top of the backswing with the wrist then hinging a bit to the top to flatten that wrist slightly to get into the perfect position. Now, as most of you would know, the backswing creates the downswing creates the impact. So working on the backswing is the easiest thing to do and the thing that makes the most sense. Trying to change your downswing when it's as quick as it is and it's reactive to what the backswing does is not the best idea. Sometimes it's definitely what we need to do because we need to make a quicker change and we need to influence the things that we need to influence. But really today what I want to talk about is how we can load these wrists correctly to the top of the backswing, feel like we unload them in a more natural way in the way down and explode them more post-impact. And that kind of maintaining to a degree, not throwing, and the explosion post-impact helps deliver the club with the correct pressure, the correct compression, the correct speed to play great golf and make that pure contact every time, that low point in the right spot every time. Let's get back to the takeaway. So I'm going to give you a few ways in which you can experiment with this to get the right takeaway. The first way we're going to do is stick an alignment rod just down the shaft like this. It's a little bit more uncomfortable on your fingers, but otherwise it's a great visual feedback tool. If we take our setup as normal, if I hinge those wrists early, you'll see this club and the rod point to the right of target almost instantaneously. And also it's very much pointing parallel to the ground in terms of height. If I do a correct takeaway, it's going to work more down my lead leg and it's going to point more down to the ground, and it doesn't point towards target initially. It points more towards my body and then up. As we get to the top of the swing from there, again, I want this angle to change. So as I get to the top of the swing, this rod will point pretty much away towards the camera, not way up in the air. So if I keep that wrist under some kind of structure in terms of the radial movement, we won't overset and overcollapse those wrists at the top. So we want basically an early action with the wrists and then maintain it. And the reason for that is when we get a lot of flappy wrists at the top, it tends to lead to this kind of over the top and messy, narrow downswing as we get into transition. If it's nice and structured and wide at the top, we can then move and the arms pull towards the golf ball and the wrist can unload naturally without being thrown or cast early or widening or narrowing the arc too much. So it gives us much more stability and structure in that transition area of the golf swing, which then helps to get the downswing and delivery position exactly where we want it. So the first drill is grabbing this rod and making some swings, feeling that structure, working the club down so the rod now is parallel to the ground in this delivery position and pointing slightly to the right, and then goes past the body like so. If we do that with a rod, we are creating all the wrist actions we would want. And those are the feels we want to take into the normal shots. The only thing you could add to that, if we go more inflection at the top, the rod will point a little bit more to the right as I'm stood here now, but off at this angle. And that will give us the right feel of wrist flexion also. The wrists at the top want to have roughly about 10 degrees of extension or less. So Dustin Johnson's minus 40, he'd be over here somewhere. Tour average is about 10 degrees of extension. But certainly most guys on tour, you'll see the shaft won't quite reach parallel with an iron shot. So again, those wrists are definitely not overworking that area. There's always exceptions to the rule and outliners, but what I'm looking at here is the commonality of great ball strikers, the commonality of great players, and what I would like to see you do in terms of a motion and a pattern to play great, consistent golf. So if you're brave, you can go ahead and hit a couple of shots of this. I would recommend if you do that, you do it at slow speed. So let's just go ahead and do one of those. So again, along my body, nice and wide. And then ideally, very little contact on the way through. Just caught my rib cage there on the way through because my hands were probably a little bit flippier than I want. But certainly with practice, I would get rid of that contact on the way through also. Let's hit you up with a second, much easier drill to let you just hit golf balls focusing on the wrist direction. Okay, so I've got 2 golf balls down here in the ground. The second ball it's about 3 club head widths back and it's on a slight inward arc as we would see here. Now the idea in this ball is twofolded. We can use it to miss it or hit it. If we're going to try and hit it, I'd roll it probably 1 club head width closer. I'll show you that as well though. But the idea is now, obviously if I don't set my wrists, you'll see there I'll just nudge that golf ball out the way. So that shows you my wrists there aren't working up in that radial sense quick enough. If obviously I missed that outside or inside, again in terms of a visual, we can see then that the direction of the swing isn't quite where we want it to be. So the initial thing could be hit some shots trying to go over the top of the golf ball, setting those wrists as we do it, and obviously on the way down we never would want to hit that from in terms of a low point as well. So initially we just go and hit some golf balls. Where we feel we wouldn't make contact with the ball and use it very much as a visual. That'll help encourage you to get that earlier wrist cock or radial deviation to set those wrists and load those wrists on the journey we want. And again, load them early and kind of lock them out is the feeling I would want you to have. Let's show you the second drill. I think Nelly Korda does this one also. So for this one, we'll put the golf ball in much closer, about 2 club head widths apart. And the idea in this one would be we're going to try and knock that ball out of the way with some force. And adding that force to it helps again initiate this kind of a little bit more wrist flicking action upwards. But knocking it out of the way also guarantees we're going in the correct direction. So if we don't hit the ball, the direction of the swing is going to be off. We've got it close enough that we can hit it and still load those wrists still the way we want. So it's kind of a pushing down, loading action as we go away, knocking that ball out the way of the primary ball. Take your setup, and then we're going to try and knock that ball away and swing through and hit. And that one there just guarantees I've got the correct arc of the golf swing at the same time as trying to load those wrists correctly. From a downswing point of view, we've talked about it very briefly, but what I'm after is basically from the top of the backswing position, the arms come down and forward at the same time. This wrist angle is always unloading, but I would never want you to consciously feel you unload it unless you've got a very laggy golf swing. If you consciously think about unloading it, you're probably going to cast it more. And if I said to you the golfer would cast the golf club too much, then why are we going to try and feed what the average golfer does too much? For me, it doesn't make sense. So I definitely want you to feel you're just trying to focus on moving the hands down and forward and then throw them at target as opposed to at the golf ball. And that way then we try and make sure we use this wrist action, use this kind of loaded, kind of built up power in the right area of the golf swing. I know the hands are going to be going at the fastest point before the ball, but the more we try and think of slowing down too early, the more we're going to reduce the speed at contact. Let's work on going through the ball rather than at the golf ball with the right wrist actions to play your best golf.